Good afternoon, IRLE world. Welcome to our new office, my new office here in North Denver. It's good to virtually be with you again and look forward to seeing everybody at Aspen Meadows soon enough. My task now 6 months after the first video I did is to take on the second prism, the second of 5 prisms that we talked about, which is dynamism and innovation, and what that means as a matter of economic thinking and how that fits into the economic and analytic worldview, particularly as it relates to regulation. Now, if we're going to talk about dynamism and entrepreneurship and innovation, there's really only one place to start, and that is with our favorite Austrian economist, Joseph Schumpeter, who, for the alumni, will remember his great sinister visage from the Thomas McCraw biography of the same name. And now let's talk a little bit about what Schumpeter brought and this dynamism prism and what it means. To do that, we're going to go backwards to the first prism. And the first prism, if those of you who remember Econ 101, looks something like this. And that is the prism of the perfect competition model, what Coase would later call or deride as blackboard economics. But the perfect competition model is what, in essence, neoclassical economics is looking for, and frankly, what regulation is looking for in its effort to make sure that monopoly power is not being used to harm customers, raise prices, and lower output. And that's the typical lower marginal cost curve that we know and maybe shudder from seeing back in Econ 101. And that is really what Schumpeter was taking on. Schumpeter was an economist. He grew up in Austria. He was actually the finance minister of Austria during the hyperinflation years of the 1920s. And what he determined and what he wrote in his seminal work, Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy in the 40s, was that that neoclassical model, that neoclassical look for efficiency was missing not just part of the picture, but actually the biggest part of the picture. And the biggest part of the picture to Schumpeter and the biggest part of the picture to us as economic analysts is innovation. And that innovation and dynamism is really the story of capitalism. What does that mean? Well, it means that capitalism is a process of, in Schumpeter's phrase, creative destruction. That it's not the static picture of an economy that we care about. It's the picture of an economy where dynamism is both encouraged and unleashed, and that it's the new product, the new market that matters, not that old widget blackboard stale vision. The second point that Schumpeter would make is that competition for the market is more important than competition in the market. And again, that goes back to the neoclassical model, which is concerned with competition in the market. What Schumpeter and the dynamists care about is the preconditions and the institutional structure such that new markets can emerge, new products can emerge, and that means that a monopoly in a dynamism prism is not a bug, but in fact a feature. And what do we mean by that? That means that the person who invents the new product, creates the new market, is by definition going to have for him or herself a monopoly. And that is not a problem for public policy or a problem for regulators, because in fact, something that had not existed before is now there, and customers benefit from that. And that dynamic efficiency is what you're looking for. Now, what does dynamic efficiency mean to a regulator? Well, the answer is it's really tough for a regulator to wrestle with dynamic efficiency, because it essentially, at a strong version, blows up all of those intuitions and all of those imperatives you might have had to regulate from a neoclassical impetus. In a dynamic prism, you may not care so much. And antitrust law, in fact, is a great place where this has been struggling with, and telecommunications has also been where you've seen the dynamic prism at work. I think it's interesting, and we'll talk at the end of my little foray here about dynamism in the electric industry. But what dynamism does is say that, again, monopoly is a feature, not a bug, and a strong Schumpeterian dynamist may not care very much at all about market power issues, about market dominance issues, because in fact, that party, that entity who created the new product is the one that both should be rewarded for it and is creating the incentives for someone to come along and, in a subsequent gale of creative destruction, to take over that with yet a new market. Now, the problem and the challenge that is practically for regulation is that regulation doesn't like dynamism, frankly, because regulation is premised on, I think, an insight that this market is mature and this market is full of a durable monopoly, and that monopoly is not going to be overcome by subsequent waves of creative destruction. What do I mean concretely by creative destruction? So telephony in the United States was regulated for nearly 100 years as a monopoly at the state and federal level. The FCC and the state commissions respectively regulated long distance as well as local service. And that monopoly was durable, and it hung around for a long time until, the 80s and the modified final judgment, and the 90s, when you started having computer technology and the Silicon Revolution change what was possible in telephony. And that's how, in part, we got the 96 Telecommunications Act, which was saying instead of a monopoly model, we were going to go to a competitive model. And that creative destruction came in the form of many things, but principally it came in the form of this, the cell phone, when the landline was no longer a durable monopoly, but could in fact be avoided entirely by cellular telephony. That's what Schumpeter means by creative destruction, what we mean by dynamic innovation. And when that happens, of course, we got two problems, which is you probably don't want to regulate the formally regulated or the monopoly regulated platform, because that monopoly platform needs to have the freedom to respond if it can. And all of those embedded cost structures, all of those subsidy structures in particular that had previously existed in the closed, contained monopoly universe of telephony, they get eroded in a number of ways. So in a Schumpeterian model, the regulatory model cannot hold. The other problem the Schumpeterian model brings to regulators is cost curve shift, right? Cost of service regulation is notionally a neoclassical toolbox. It's notionally a toolbox that expresses costs to not go, to go consistent with inflation, but not have the situation that we had in telephony, where a $10 million circuit switch can be replaced by a $1,000 router. And when that happens, the cost basis for regulation falls out from underneath you. And that, in fact, is what happened in telephony in the 1990s. It was great for the incumbent providers who were experiencing great benefits from it. It was not so great for customers in the sense that the regulators couldn't keep up with the shifting cost curves. Let's talk about what dynamism means then, and Schumpeterian dynamism means to the regulator, which is one, I think you need to take a first swag at, is this a market where dynamism is happening? And I think we can say, for instance, in electricity that yes, it is, not in all aspects of the network for sure, but certainly on the generation side and certainly on the end use side, when you are now replacing a billion-dollar coal plant with a multi-million-dollar wind farm or solar array. Now, obviously, different operational characteristics, but you do start to see with the evolution of storage and the cost curves of renewables that we're in a dynamic moment, and that creates challenges for the regulator, both in wanting to encourage that dynamism to continue, but also in having to, frankly, swallow some stranded cost issues that are going to arise when you can replace that billion-dollar plant with $100 million gas turbine. Do you want to strand that? And you probably, as a matter of takings law, have an obligation to pay for that, whether you want to or not. So the dynamic prism here is really important as an institutional matter, and what you as a regulator want to try and preserve and encourage are those dynamic forces in the system. Now, Schumpeter, a couple points, which if for those of you who remember reading it or haven't read it, he's an Austrian who wrote in English, which means he never shunned or never forgot that he loves those long German compound sentences. So he's tough to read, but he is profound, and he's very important to understand if you're going to get regulatory analysis right. You need to think about, is this a Schumpeterian market or not? And how can I, as a regulator, bring about the dynamic competition and create the incentives for dynamic competition that we want to get things, faster, cheaper, better. And that always has to be kind of sitting there in the back of your mind as you do the traditional regulatory enterprise, which frankly likes static, and not static because it's bad, but static because that's how you regulate things, and that's how you get a cost picture. So Schumpeter is, my favorite economist, or at least he's in the top 3 or 4. He's a puckish fellow who writes difficult, but also I think in an intriguing fashion, and he really challenges and augments the fundamental neoclassical basis for the regulatory enterprise. So don't forget the Schump when you are thinking as a regulator, and hopefully Lynn Kiesling will share my boosterism for what Schumpeter means. Good to at least virtually be with you. Hope to be at Aspen Meadows soon or someday, and we can talk about some of the interesting personal anecdotes about Schumpeter. Take care. Talk to you soon.